All right. Hello, everyone. So welcome to our last class of the term. So we finally made it. Just a few housekeeping things before we get started. First, I have to find, let's see, we were just finishing um, via our slides. I believe we were just about to start slide 29. So if you've got the slides open, that's where you'll want to go to follow along. I'll just share my screen. As for the housekeeping stuff, um, so I guess most of you have probably seen the announcement that if you handed in your essay proposals via the submission Dropbox on Brightspace, then you will have your grade and feedback for that available to you now. The ones that were emailed to me because of extensions and so forth, due to extenuating circumstances, those will be returned today. So that will be do will this okay, I'll answer that question in a moment. Those will be returned today. The content for today's lecture is not featured on quiz 5, but there is some content from the first part of our lecture on consciousness, so last Wednesday's lecture, and of course the lecture on mental content. However, it is a half quiz. It's still worth the same weight, but it's only out of 10 marks instead of 20. And there are 5 multiple choice true false questions. Most of those deal with mental content. And the one short written answer question allows you some choice. It's kind of like a double question, and you can pick which thing you want to talk about. I believe the topics are either philosophical zombies or Mary the Color Scientist, those 2 thought experiments. You can pick which one you want to talk about and get up to 5 marks for your answer. So yes, that all of that is just to say that uh, the feedback for the emailed proposals will be finished this evening. Then I will be catching up on the marking for the quizzes. So over the coming days, you'll get feedback for the previous quizzes you've written that I haven't had a chance to provide feedback for yet. And of course, quiz 5. And one final thing, I will be keeping an open door policy over the exam period. Of course, the exam period is when you'll be working on your essay. So if any of you have any questions or concerns as you work on that, I'll be available by appointment, and you can email me and ask me anything you need to concerning the research and writing process. So if you get stuck, don't panic, don't feel shy about coming to talk to me. Send me an email and we'll schedule a meeting. And if you run into any roadblocks or hiccups or anything like that that interferes with the writing process, we can get that taken care of. All right, so I believe that is everything for the housekeeping. Now, let's see. I believe we left off here in our discussion of zombies, and we were moving on to this idea of Cartesian materialism. This is sort of related to something that we've encountered before, particularly in one of the early chapters in Kim, the idea of the Cartesian theater, right? This is the idea that your mind and the contents of your mind are like the happenings on a stage or screen, and you are the audience member. You're the sole audience member. And everything in your experience, like take, for example, this visual experience I'm having now, the computer in front of me, the tactile experience of sitting on my couch, all of these aspects of my experience are what are happening on the stage or the screen of the mind. And me, my mind, myself, I'm the audience member. Now, philosopher Daniel Dennett calls commitment to this idea, this Cartesian theater idea, Cartesian materialism. What he means is that um, most even though most thinkers today disavow substance dualism, they still think of the mind in Cartesian terms, even though they are materialists. And one of the ways that this is sort of expressed, or one of the ways you find this expressed, is as a belief in the Cartesian theater. So, um, like I've said in the bottom 2 points, these people are physicalists. Descartes wasn't, he was a substance dualist. But they still think that there might be a special place in the brain and even a special time at which everything comes together and our conscious experience happens. In other words, a commitment to Cartesian materialism or an endorsement of some kind of Cartesian theory, Cartesian theater view amounts to um, amounts to thinking that there's a special place in the brain where, like, that's the consciousness part of our brain, kind of similar to how Descartes thought that the pineal gland was the locus of interaction between the immaterial soul and the material body. Cartesian materialists, and you still see this today in discussions of everything from neuroscience to artificial intelligence, a sort of tacit commitment to this idea that there's a special time in the place, time and place in the brain where the magic happens, right? This is how it's represented in one of the supplementary readings that I made available to you. This is an illustration by, I believe it's actually Susan Blackmore's son who does these illustrations. But this is essentially the idea behind the Cartesian theater, right? There's you, there's yourself, and here are your screens and speakers, and this is where everything comes in for you, the audience, and then you're able to control the body almost as if you're the pilot of a giant robot, right? And that's why sometimes I like to use that giant robot analogy rather than the theater analogy. But it's still a Cartesian materialist way to look at it, whether you think theater or giant robot, right? Um, One of the problems with this, which we again discussed earlier in the course, is the homunculus problem, right? If this is how the mind works, say, there's a little self in here that receives all of the inputs from the sensory systems and initiates all the outputs to the motor systems, and all of the thinking happens, because of this little self in here. Well, then how does this guy work? Does he have one of these apparatus in his head? And if so, how does that one work? And so it's an infinite regress. It's homunculi all the way down, as it were. That's the homunculus problem. Now, this is not to say that, just because the theater metaphor is something that we should dispense with, according to Dennett, this is not to say that we shouldn't pay any close attention to what's happening um, in the mind, for lack of a better term. Even Dennett, I think, would have disapproved of terminology like, in the mind, because the mind is not a place in which things happen. Um, but we do have mental imagery. We do have mental, auditory phenomena. We all have imaginations, most of us. There are some exceptions to this, of course. If I ask you to picture something in your head, um, most of you can probably do that, if not all of you. But there are a few individuals out there who have an interesting condition called aphantasia, and that is a lack of mental imagery. And that imagery here is used loosely. It doesn't just mean literal images. It can also mean like a lack of an inner monologue, for example. I wonder if I put this question to all of you. How would you describe your mental imagery if you have mental imagery, right? Is it rich and vivid, or is it maybe more like an aphantasiacs? That is someone with aphantasia. Okay, so let's see what's happening in the chat. Jacob says rich. And Jack says doesn't feel like a strong imagery. Thomas says most is weak, but can be very rich with focus. Michael says colorful. Janita pretty clear. So okay, pretty typical range of experience. I haven't actually met an aphantasiac myself that I know of, but they do exist. Um, but most of us, it sounds like, would be able to do something like this quite easily, manipulate our mental imagery. And this is what Shepard and Metzler did in the early 1970s. And this is one of the things that one of the studies that sort of reinitiated empirical focus on the contents of consciousness. William James um, was a famous advocate for the importance of introspectionism. Oh, Cass says, I've got a friend like that. She can't picture anything in her head. Okay, yeah, so that is aphantasia. And when I try to imagine what that's like, it's curious because I have quite rich mental imagery. Um, uh, but yeah, some people don't think in words or pictures at all. For me, that's difficult to imagine, right? But they are out there. They do exist, and there's kind of it's sort of like a spectrum in terms of the richness of our mental imagery, where there are aphantasiacs on the one hand, and then very visual, perhaps, or very very like auditorily heavy kind of mental imagery, like on the other hand. So that's very curious. Yeah, so she writes, that's really interesting. I wonder if it's just a lack of imagery, like visual imagery, or whether she has an inner monologue or not. Um, yeah, curious. So these mental rotation studies, granted, as I was saying, you had thinkers like William James who emphasized the value of introspection. You had the phenomenologists like Edmund Husserl, who were sort of like radical empiricists about the way consciousness presents, or about how consciousness is presented to us, to the experiencer, right? Um, and both those camps were very, very much in favor of paying attention to what was going on the mental screen, for the lack of a better term. But with the advent of behaviorism, this sort of thing fell out of favor. But after the cognitive revolution, which was, I suppose, the main thrust of that went underway in the 1960s. In the early 70s, you had studies on mental imagery like those of Shepard and Metzler. And what they would do is give the participants in these studies these pairs of block images, right? And it was kind of like a same different task. So they would present you with some images like those in picture A, picture B, picture C, and you'd have to push one of two buttons to indicate whether these images were the same shape but just rotated in a different orientation, or whether they were different shapes. Now I want you all to try this. So just try with A first. We want to know if this one is the same as this one, and whether this one has just been rotated into a different orientation, or whether they are different shapes altogether. So what do we see? Let's do a little mental rotation. Look at this one and rotate it in your mind and see if it's the same as this one. What do we see when we do this? Yep, they're the same. That's right. How about we try B? B's a little trickier. That's right. Now when we come to C, what do we see? That's right. Now, a couple of interesting findings came out of these studies. Um, they found, for example, that there was a linear relationship between the degree of rotation and the response time from the participants. That means that the more rotated, regardless of whether they were the same or different, the more rotated one figure was, the longer it took participants to determine whether they were the same shape or not, which suggests that the participants really were manipulating mental representations in order to do this. But where is the rotation happening? You're seeing this you're seeing this in your mind, right? And it seems to you that what you are seeing is on some kind of mental screen. But that can't be the case. So how does it come to seem this way? And where is the rotation really happening? That's a really good question that we haven't worked out completely. Now, as I mentioned before, this was one of the first sets of experiments to take seriously the idea of, um, internal visual representations. It wasn't the first. In fact, I think that Edward Tolman's rat studies, which happened in the 1940s, if I'm not mistaken, and Tolman was a behaviorist, but in order to explain these empirical results he was getting from how these rats were learning to run these mazes that he'd set up, it could only have been possible to explain their behavior by positing that these rats were forming mental maps. He had these groups of rats where one group of rats would have to learn to run a maze, and they would get a reward every time they finished the maze. And a second group of rats who just were never given a reward, and they would just kind of wander the maze aimlessly. But as soon as he started giving them a reward, the second group, who had not been previously rewarded, those rats were finishing the maze faster than the first rats. And to explain this, Tolman proposed that, well, the rats, when they were wandering aimlessly, were learning the layout of the maze. And once they began to be rewarded, the rats were like, "Oh, well, if we just go right through the maze, we get a treat. Let's go. I already know where to go," thought the rat. So that's what was going on there. This is, of course, a few decades after that, but it was one of the first experiments to really take seriously, um, subjective experience in humans. And as we learned last time when we were talking about Nagel and his bats, subjectivity is the key feature of conscious experience. The fact that there's something that it's like for a subject to be conscious, right? That's the key. Phenomenality or subjectivity. Um, One way to think about this is that these representations are quite literally imagistic representations. They're not like strings of ones and zeros. If a computer were to do this same experiment, um, it would be, there shouldn't be this linear relationship that we observe in human participants between the degree of rotation and response time. For a computer, it's all ones and zeros. So it should take about the same amount of time, so long as the images contain the same amount of information, they're the same size in terms of bits. It shouldn't take the computer any longer or shorter based on how rotated the shapes are. But it does with us, which suggests, as you can probably see from doing this experiment yourself, that it takes you longer to rotate that shape in your mind's eye and compare it to the first shape. So we're dealing with an imagistic representation, a representation that preserves the physical features of the thing that it's representing, the visual and other physical features. Of course, we still don't really know what's up, right? We don't know. Well, some thinkers are concerned about where in the mind this is happening. Some thinkers think that those sorts of questions are wrong-headed. There is no where, there's no place in the mind where things come together. So the mental imagery debate that was kicked off by Shepard and Metzler's interesting study still continues to the previous day. But the takeaway here for thinkers like Kim and Blackmore and Dennett is that these experiments show that we can indeed observe and measure private experience. They don't show us what we should not take away from this, though, is that these things are projected or presented on some kind of screen or stage. Um, the way that it seems to us when we're picturing and rotating these shapes may not be the way it's actually working. This might be one of those cases where our conscious experience misleads us as to the nature of the workings of consciousness, right? We can also do mental rotations unconsciously. So, um, in this experiment, you have to sort of consciously picture the two shapes and rotate them and compare them. But we can rotate things unconsciously all the time. So when I reach out to pick up this coffee cup, for example, and when I put it back down, you can't see it because I'm off screen, but when I'm picking it up, I'm kind of the handle's facing me and I take it and I have to turn it like this. And when I put it back down, I do the same thing. But I'm not thinking about it as I do it. I was that time because I had to show you all. But normally I'm not conscious of what I'm doing. When you're parking your car, if you're good at parking your car, certainly I was never good at parking cars, but you're relying on a lot of unconscious cognition there. When you're reaching out to open a door or to place a key into a lock, you're relying on unconscious um, unconscious motor processing, and this is evidenced by the dual visual system hypothesis, where I mentioned this last time with respect to change, with respect to the zombie in your head and the blindsided individuals. When I reach out and pick up a coffee cup, my visual experience makes it seem as though, it's what I'm consciously aware of that's available for reasoning and planning. In other words, my phenomenal consciousness of the coffee cup on the table um, also makes its way into my access consciousness, if you like. So I'm seeing the coffee cup, and that visual representation is what allows me to, reach out and grab it. But that's actually not true. Reaching out, picking up, turning things, manipulating things in the world, pointing to where things are, is underwritten by the dorsal visual pathway, which is not conscious. And that's why blindsided individuals, if they have damage to, say, um, the left temporal area, such that they have some blind sight in their right eye, they might not see that coffee cup if it's in their blind spot. But if you ask them to reach out and pick up the object in their blind spot, they'll reach out and successfully grab it by the handle like this, as I've done, even though they can't consciously see what it is. So those are all examples of unconscious mental rotations. And they're unconscious because that stream of visual processing is itself unconscious. So we also know, at least when it comes to the conscious side of things, that when we mentally rotate, say, one of the figures in Shepard and Metzler's study, we see the same visual areas become active as when we're actually looking at the object in our environment, right? So if I was rotating a shape in my mind, the same brain centers would show activity as the brain centers that are recruited when I'm, actually looking at the pictures of the objects. So, and this is also what happens when we employ our mental imagery. When we, if you picture the face of a friend, or if you think of your favorite song and you listen to your favorite song in your head, the same areas of the brain are active when you do that, that are active when you're actually looking at the face of your friend or listening to your favorite song. Even when we dream, we have, well, unless we're aphantasiacs, we have very rich experiences. Dreams have imagery, they have sound, they have touch, and other senses as well. Like um, people can will wake up and describe a sense of motion in some dreams, or a sense of losing your balance. Um, the only one that seems to be a little bit less active in dreams is olfaction, which is strange. We're not really sure why that is, but the point is that when your brain is dreaming, it's generating a representation using the same neural machinery that it does to generate a representation when you are awake. The only difference is that when I'm awake, the information that my brain is using to generate this representation, say of me right here in this living room giving this lecture, that information comes from an external source, namely the world. And when I'm dreaming, it comes from my own mind, which is why dreams are so weird and wacky, because you don't have a stable external source of sensory information. So just a little bit of dream trivia for you there. Now, all of this is very cool, and it's very tempting, I think, to think about this in terms of Cartesian materialism. Like, it seems to us that all of this happens on some kind of mental screen, but this is misleading, right? The homunculus problem arises if you say that, I am the self in the theater or in the giant robot. Well, how does that self work? Does it have a little self inside of itself, right? We would go on and on and on. It would be homunculi all the way down. An infinite regress like this is always um, it's always a sign that we need to sort of rethink how we're approaching a problem. So it can't be the case. Um, it cannot be the case that it works this way. Now, Christoph Koch and Francis Crick say that there can be an observer in the mind, but that doesn't necessarily entail an infinite regress. They say, for example, that perhaps there are parts of the brain observing other parts of the brain. Maybe parts of the frontal lobe observe parts of the sensory systems which tend to be toward the back of the brain. This would give you what they say is the illusion of a homunculus in the head looking at the sensory activities of the brain, but it's not as if there's a little human in there. It's just that these certain parts of the brain are working in concert with each other, observing activity in other parts of the brain. So if Crick and Koch are right, then this illusory sort of Cartesian materialism, this sense of the Cartesian theater, right, really just reflects the way our brains are organized. But we would still, if this were the case, have to work out how it is that the brain looks at itself in this way. And this is a, heavy air quotes here when I say looks at itself. Any questions so far about mental imagery and the Cartesian theater? All right. Okay, what do we got here? Okay, no questions so far. So, how many of you were before this class and the previous class? Whoops. How many of you were tempted, or at least found this notion of the Cartesian theater plausible? Perhaps some of you were skeptics, and perhaps some of you thought that because this is the way it seems, this must be the way it works. Taylor says she may have been. Jack says not me, but that's because of other philosophy classes. Sorry, that's Jack Reagan, of course. And Jack Yeager says, I like the idea, but doesn't seem strong. Yeah, it's intuitive, right? Because this is the way it seems to us. But when we think about it, we realize it can't actually work this way. But it's very appealing because it does seem, at any rate, to work this way, right? Yeah, Michael, that's a good point. Like, it is a useful way to describe what's in focus, or I would say what what your attention is focused on, especially attention, right? Um, and that's where we get into sort of like, when we talk about things being on the stage or on the screen or in the spotlight is another one that we're going to encounter on the next slide. Um, it is an awfully tempting way to talk about attention. And when it comes, speaking of attention, why is it that we are aware of some things and not others consciously? We're aware of some of our perceptions and not others. We're aware of some beliefs and some desires, but we're unaware of others, right? Why is this? Arguably, some of it has to do with attention, right? I mean, some things are just going to be unconscious. And the example that I used last time is the way you are understanding what I'm saying to you right now, or reading something, right? Like if you're either a native speaker of English or a fluent speaker of English, you probably don't have to try to understand what someone is saying to you in conversation. Your brain just kind of takes care of that for you, right? Those are unconscious, automatic mental mechanisms at work. And you don't have to think about it in order to make that stuff happen, right? Oh, interesting. Jack Reagan says, one of my friends recently told me they have been sleep texting. That's interesting. I wonder, if are the texts coherent or are they nonsense? They are coherent. Wow. The reason I ask is because I I sleep. Oh, okay. So they actually don't remember sending the text. Wow. I think your friend might be undergoing a bout of somnambulism. I'm not a medical doctor, but that sounds like, sometimes when people sleepwalk, they do things like this. Your friend might be a somnambulist. But I talk in my sleep, and my partner has this funny habit of recording me do it to show me when I wake up. And most of what I say is utter nonsense, but it seems to make sense to me when I'm uttering it, you know. And she's talking to me, and I'm just replying in word salad, and I don't remember doing it. And then I wake up and I see the video of me rambling about some kind of nonsense in my sleep, and mine is very incoherent. Um, so But that, Jack's friend's sleep texting would be another example of something being unconscious, another way in which something can be unconscious. And that's probably due to, physiological differences between sleeping and wakefulness and whatever's going on in cases of somnambulism or sleepwalking. These somnambulism and related phenomena don't actually happen when we're dreaming. A lot of people think that if you sleepwalk, what you're doing is acting out a dream or something, but that's actually not true. Sleepwalking occurs in non-REM sleep predominantly. When we're in REM sleep, that's when we dream, and we also are largely paralyzed in REM sleep, except for our eyes and our lungs and heart. Most other muscles will do no more than twitch because signals coming out of the brain, motor signals, are inhibited. And that is so that we don't get up and act out our dreams and injure ourselves. So it's actually, if you think about it like an evolutionary adaptation. But attention is one way in which something can be conscious, right? I mean, Not all of you were probably conscious of the way, if you're sitting down, the seat feels uh, on your rear end right now. However, you are aware of this now that I've brought it into consciousness, right? But of course, we're taking a pretty physicalist approach. So whatever's going on, conscious or unconscious, has got to be related to brain activity. So there might be some special kind of brain activity um, that correlates with consciousness. You know, some activity we could potentially look and see on a brain scan whether oh, this activity underwrites something conscious or unconscious, right? And go back to the driving example, right? If you're driving, especially if you're a very experienced driver, you could be having a conversation with your friend, or looking at the scenery, or listening to some music or a podcast, and you're paying attention to that and not paying very close attention to what you're doing in the car, yet you're driving perfectly safely. You're kind of on automatic pilot. And sure, if something very surprising happens, like if an animal leaps out onto the road, you could brake or swerve to avoid it, because your consciousness takes over. But barring anything like that, you're just kind of driving along on automatic pilot. And those two kinds of activity would presumably be underwritten or subserved by different sorts of brain activity. And so there's a temptation here to say, well, it must be that brain activity that makes the magic difference, right? This brain activity is conscious, so this is the place in the brain where it all comes together. But that's wrong. There's no magical time and place in the brain nor the mind where it all comes together. So, what are some theories of consciousness that will work as an alternative to the Cartesian theater? Well, there's Bernard Bahr's global workspace theory. And perhaps you've heard of this. It's based on the theater metaphor or the theater hypothesis. Um, Basically, the idea is that consciousness is what is broadcast from the spotlight of attention through a sort of global workspace with all these different mental mechanisms. And if we go backstage, what's not on the stage, backstage, we have unconscious processes. The spotlight, as I mentioned, is attention. The rest of the stage is meant to represent working memory. And whatever's in the spotlight can be broadcast to the entire theater throughout the entire workspace, as it were. Here's a representation of Bahr's global workspace theory. So we have context operators behind the scenes. These are unconscious. Uh, if we were to anthropomorphize them, these unconscious processes, we might say that there's a director and a spotlight controller and other, stage hands and so forth backstage. And what do? Well, um, they oversee all of these things that are competing for access to consciousness. So all of our senses from the outside world, like sight, sound, touch, taste, olfaction, all kinds of what Bertrand Russell would have called sense data from the environment, is competing for access to the stage. There's also inner senses. These could be things like dreams, mental images, your inner monologue, your emotions. It um, might include unconscious computations of some kind, right? That might be fighting to be conscious. Ideas like beliefs and desires. All of these are competing to get into the spotlight of attention. And then whatever gets in here becomes conscious and it's broadcast throughout the workspace. So, Bernard Bahr, because he's based global workspace theory on the theater metaphor, he does think that Dennett's concerns over Cartesian materialism are a little bit misplaced, because Bahr's doesn't think that, here in the spotlight, this is where consciousness happens. No, consciousness is emergent for Bahr's. It emerges out of the functioning of all of these systems working in concert with one another. So Bars uses the theater metaphor, but he's not literally arguing that it actually works this way, that there is a special spot in the brain where the magic happens. That's not what he's saying. But he's using an analogy that's based on the way that it seems to us to try to explain how it all works. So again, don't think of what's in the spotlight as the magical conscious part of the mind. Rather, it's all of the behind the scenes stuff, the audience stuff, and what's happening on the stage, all of the things competing to get into consciousness, the broadcast from the spotlight of attention throughout the global workspace. Consciousness emerges out of all of those things working in concert with one another. Now, Bars thinks there might be something like a convergence zone in the brain that functions like a global workspace, but it's still not a discrete place within the brain, right? You might compare it with a staircase, rather, where if you're talking about visual experience, the brain regions, when it comes to like object recognition. So we're talking something in we're talking my temporal lobes, the end point of the um, ventral processing stream. Um, what Blackmore says about this is that these brain regions appear to be where the contents of consciousness emerge. That's like a convergence zone where, that's the end point of the mental representations, from the light hitting this coffee cup, hitting my retinas, going through my early visual system, and then going down into the ventral stream. Finally, I end up with this visual representation of an object that I can identify as a coffee cup. But that's not to say that consciousness is there in my temporal lobes at the end point of the ventral visual stream, right? You understand what I'm saying? So Bars rejects these Cartesian daydreams. But one thing that he still does that I think Dennett was probably right to criticize him about is that he does say that there are some things in and out of consciousness at any given time. And that is, according to Dennett, an indicator of the Cartesian materialist outlook, because consciousness is not something that things can be in or out of. That's the wrong way to think about it. It's a category mistake, Dennett would say. So everybody clear on everything so far? One thing that's good about the global workspace, and this is discussed in Kim's final chapter, um, is that it might make for a good way to think about the architecture of the mind. Um, if you've taken if you've taken any cognitive science classes, for example, I know we have some cognitive science majors in this class, you will have no doubt learned about mental architecture, cognitive architecture. Now, cognitive architecture usually means something like it's some kind of artifact, um, like ACT-R, right? Like a cognitive architecture, which is a toolbox that gives you the things you need to build an intelligent system. Think of a cognitive architecture. If you're like me and you like video games, think of it like a video game engine, right? Let's say you want to make a video game, right? What are you going to do? Are you going to program the entire thing from scratch? Or are you going to use Unreal Engine, right? You're going to use some kind of engine that gives you all the tools you need to create your game. You're not going to do it line by line from scratch. Um, you're not programming for the Game Boy here. You want to make it simple for yourself. That's what a cognitive architecture does. A mental architecture is the architecture of the human mind, or any mind. How is it organized? How does the information flow through the systems? What kind of cognitive mechanisms are implemented what brain regions implement them and what do they do, right? These are the questions we ask when we talk about a mental architecture. Maybe global workspace theory gives us a pretty good mental architecture. We can also supplement global workspace theory with higher order perception and higher order thought theories. These are ideas where that say that what we are conscious of um, require either a higher order perception or a higher order thought. So if you have like a lower level perception, it might just be like this coffee cup. Again, always use the coffee cup. But if I have a perception of the coffee cup, that's a higher order perception. And now I'm conscious of the coffee cup because I'm perceiving that I am perceiving the cup. And hot theory is the same way, where instead of a higher order perception, you need a higher order thought. So I have this perception of the coffee cup, and then I have a thought, oh, I'm thinking about how I'm perceiving the coffee cup. And that's what makes it conscious. But then a question is entry into this global workspace the cause of something becoming conscious or a consequence of something becoming conscious? That's something that we have yet to work out. And global workspace theory, for a number of years, researchers have talked about using it as a means of implementing or potentially implementing artificial consciousness. I remember all the way back in 2014 when I went to my first and only international conference. It was a robotics and philosophy conference, and one of the presenters in their presentation made mention of using Bars's theory in as a cognitive architecture for a robot. So this has been taken seriously for quite some time, right? But I think Blackmore's question here still stands. That is, if something enters the global workspace, is that because it's becoming consciousness, or is something entering the workspace a consequence of it having become conscious? Right? It's kind of like what's playing which causal role here. That's something we still have to work out. And also, the big problem: how does global access within the workspace explain qualia? Does it even explain qualia? Like, can something in the spotlight of attention, okay, that's in the spotlight, that's being broadcast throughout the workspace. How does that explain qualia? Right? If Bars's theory doesn't explain qualia, then we need to keep searching for a theory of consciousness that will explain it. It doesn't mean global workspace theory is 100% wrong, but it might mean that we need to go a little bit further to supplement it somehow, right? Now, Bars's theory, the point I really wanted to emphasize there is that Bars's theory uses the theater metaphor, but of course there are some theories of consciousness which avoid the theater metaphor. Benjamin Liebe had a theory of neuronal adequacy, where events become conscious when the neurons that are involved are active enough for long enough. So nothing is going to, for lack of a better term, enter consciousness unless it's been activated to a great enough degree for a long enough time. Otherwise, you won't become conscious of it. Francis Crick has something he calls the astonishing hypothesis, where he avoids the theater metaphor. He says that your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. But, so this is pretty physicalist, right? But he still compares attention to the idea of a spotlight, just as Bars does. And then, of course, we have Patricia and Paul Churchland, who, as we've seen, are eliminative materialists. They avoid the theater metaphor. They are, kind of like really hardline um, uh, psychoneural, like identity theory people. But instead of just simply identifying brain states or mental events with brain events, they say, why don't we get rid of talk of the mental altogether? Now, Paul Churchland's actually okay with talking about qualia. He denies that there is any problem of subjectivity, writing that, for example, electromagnetic waves don't cause light, they're not correlated with light, they are light. That's what light is. In the same way, we could say that neuronal activity doesn't cause consciousness. It's not correlated with consciousness. It is consciousness. That's what consciousness is. That is very similar to what Francis Crick said on the previous slide. Now, if this works, it will avoid Cartesian materialism. But it doesn't help us overcome any of our intuitions about consciousness, none of our intuitions about subjectivity, because it's so far outside of our experience. We still have the problem of subjectivity because we only know what it's like to be us subjectively. I can know about brain events objectively by taking a neuroscience class, for example, but I don't know about my own brain events. I only know about my own conscious experience. And a scientist can give us an objective account of brain events until the cows come home, but not an objective third person account of consciousness, because consciousness is inherently subjective. That's the problem, right? That's the problem. The hard problem, as it were. Let's see how we're doing slide wise. Whoopsie daisy. I know we're actually flying through this. Oh yeah, we're getting there. We only have like really 11 more slides to go. So how about I pause and take some questions, and then we have a break, and then we come back and wrap up. And by the way, these can be questions about what we're learning today or about anything else. Taylor says, sounds good. Yeah. So, I mean, right before we wrap for a break, anyone have any questions about multiple drafts or about what Koch and Crick are saying, what the Churchlands are saying? I know we're getting pretty close to the end, and it's hard maybe to think of questions. Taylor has one about conscious experience. Yeah, so Taylor, you go ahead with your question, and then Thomas, I'll answer your question about mental and cognitive architectures.
So it's more of like a curiosity, but do you think that there will ever be like a point in the future where we would be able to look at subjectively look at brain states? I know that it's one of those questions where you talk about like is something just like what's it called? Is something like conceivable or is something actually like logically possible? So I
Yeah,
wonder if that's like something that we'll reach.
yeah, like I mean, well, I'll put it this way, like you guys know I'm a big giant Star Trek nerd, and my colleague who used he I think he maybe he still teaches it, but my colleague Phil Hoyek, who I believe is now a PhD student at McGill, he taught this philosophy and science fiction class where he would go over, Star Trek and stuff. Oh, Jack took it. Okay, so maybe Phil said this to you. I don't know. He said this to me in conversation once when we were talking about Star Trek. He said, Star Trek is the only franchise that has dualism and functionalism. And it's really true. Like, Star Trek has weird stuff with like people's brains being, or people's minds being separated from their brains and floating around disembodied like in space or whatever. And then they also have stuff like Data, where he's an artificial human who has a mind, like his positronic mind, right? And I wish that it were possible to have some kind of Star Trekky sort of solution to this where I could like, hook you up to my computer or bust out my tricorder, their little device they scan everything with, and just have an answer like, oh, the computer says it's conscious. Like, wouldn't that be wonderful? I would love if we could achieve that someday. Um, I don't know whether it's technically possible, but there must be an answer. There must be an answer why consciousness exists and how it works. Is it logically possible to figure it out? Yes. Is it technically possible? We'll see. But I believe that it is. I do believe that we will get there one day. I do not believe that it's a mysterious, unsolvable problem. And this is actually it's really good that you asked this, Taylor, because we're going to circle back at the very end of class. This is what we will be talking about, how we can answer the hard problem, right? Yeah, what movie was that, Taylor? If you don't mind me asking.
It was a Marvel movie, so I believe it was, okay, hold on, let me think. It was the one that's set in the 1940s, which is like obviously my favorite one. Where what's
Oh,
his name?
that's Captain America, right?
Yeah, Captain America, and it's the little German guy who
Oh
like,
yeah.
yeah,
Yeah,
I
yeah.
forget him, but he's always so good in those parts, and that's what I think about sometimes when you're like teaching these classes. I'm like, huh, like I wonder, is that possible?
Yeah, I mean, and it really depends on what consciousness is. Like, do you need a brain to be conscious? Well, if so, then you probably can't upload your consciousness to a computer. But if consciousness is informational and brains are just one way of implementing consciousness, you could also implement consciousness on a computer, then perhaps you could upload yourself. But then you get into all of these questions that are quite like the transporter duplicate questions. Like, if I upload myself to a computer, have I just copied myself? Is that me? It's the same, like, if Scotty beams me up, like, am I me? Or did the transporter kill me and copy me? Right? Same thing here. Arnim Zola. Okay, yeah. I mean, Marvel. Actually, I think I would challenge Professor Hoyak, and I would say that Marvel also has dualism and functionalism, not just Star Trek, because you have Jarvis and Ultron and all these super intelligent, Vision. You have all these super intelligent machines, but then also somehow there are souls. So comic books have this stuff too, right? Um, so Thomas wanted me to reiterate the difference between mental and cognitive architectures. So when I say cognitive architecture, I'm following the terminology of Jose Luis Bermudez in his cognitive science textbooks, which are the ones that I used when I used to teach. Well, it was called Intro to Cog Sci at the time. Now I think it's called something else, but I used to teach it when it was Intro. And a cognitive architecture is going to be something like SOAR or ACT-R. It's going to give you basic tools to build yourself an intelligent system. And that's why I make the analogy between a cognitive architecture and a video game engine, right? If you want to make a piece of AI, you don't want to start from scratch. You're not going to write it in machine code. You're going to use a higher level programming language like Python or a cognitive architecture. Um, if like just like programming a video game, you're not going to start from scratch. You're going to use an engine that will allow you to create objects, and it already has rules for the physics and for how things behave and how you can render textures and make environments. And you're not going to start from scratch, right? It would just be too much work. So you use a toolkit. So that's a cognitive architecture. A mental architecture is really more like, what kind of system we're dealing with. Like, the mental architecture, if I can apply that term to a computer like this, would be a symbol system, a physical symbol system. But a different kind of mental architecture would be neural networks, like the brain. or there could be hybrid systems, systems that have a little bit of neural network and a little bit of symbol system, right? So those are mental architectures. So what kind of mental architecture do I have? Well, if you're a neuroscientist, you might say um, straight up neural network, which is true. But if you're somebody like Jerry Fodor or Hillary Putnam or Alan Turing, you might say, well, what we actually have is a symbol system, and it's just implemented in um, a mushy neural network, the wetware, to borrow Andy Clark's terminology, right? So that's the difference as I see it. Well, if there are no more questions, I think we could take a quick break. Maybe we'll come back at, let's see, 3:37. Let's just come back at 3:50. And then we shall finish these slides and I'll answer any other questions. Again, these questions could pertain to the topic of today's lecture or to your final papers. So I'll see you in a little over 10 minutes. Okay, we're back. I probably will have to migrate upstairs at some point to plug my computer in, but until then, I'll just stay here. So, where were we? Well, we were about to segue into the section on Daniel Dennett's theory of multiple drafts, which I have to admit I'm a bit of a fan of. Let us, whoopsie daisy, let us make sure that the screen is shared so that you can all see the slides. All right, so Dennett starts off by saying, and this is again from Consciousness Explained, if I'm not mistaken, when you discard Cartesian dualism, you really must discard the show that would have gone on in the Cartesian theater. And the audience as well. For neither the show nor the audience is to be found in the brain, and the brain is the only real place there is to look for them. Now, I call Dennett an intuition buster because he's always using those thought experiments, those intuition pumps, to try and help his readers to clarify their thinking on what they believe about consciousness, on what their intuitions about consciousness are, etc. And one of the kinds of intuitions he's particularly interested in busting are our Cartesian materialist intuitions. As I mentioned previously, not everyone is on board with Dennett's project, right? Right? But Dan, qualia are what make life worth living. Of course, some even call him the devil, not seriously, right? But just kind of in a sort of cheeky way. Some accuse Dennett of not explaining consciousness, but rather explaining consciousness away. And does everybody understand the difference? You can explain a phenomenon, or you can explain it away as a non-phenomenon. So, for example, okay, I'll clarify. For those who aren't sure what I mean, I'll clarify. So let us say, let's come. I need a phenomenon, a natural phenomenon. It, I guess it's kind of similar to what Princess Elizabeth did. Um, kind of. Okay, lightning. Great example. Now, what are some examples of lightning, of explanations for lightning? Well, the scientific consensus is that lightning is an electrical discharge that occurs in Earth's atmosphere, right? So if you have a bolt of lightning, that's because there's some charge that has built up and gets discharged, producing a bolt of electricity And then that causes the air around it to expand rapidly, which of course we hear as thunder. So we see the lightning, we hear the thunder. That is an explanation, right? You see this natural phenomenon, lightning, and over the course of time, there have of course been many explanations for lightning, most of them divine, right? The ancient Greeks were aware that lightning in the sky and static electricity were related, but they couldn't explain how, right? In fact, our word electricity comes from the Greek electra, and electra is the word for amber, you know, fossilized or petrified tree resin. Why? Well, why we call it electricity? Well, the Greeks, when they rubbed amber with a cloth, they would see little sparks of static electricity. So now we call electricity after the Greek word for amber, electra. But so the Greeks didn't have a scientific explanation of how these phenomena were related, and in the age of myth, of course, they supposed that lightning was due to Zeus, right? Zeus throwing his thunderbolts, right? And you know, all over the world, there's always in whatever mythology you look at, there's some god who has a thunderbolt, right? Zeus, Jupiter is his Roman equivalent. He has a thunderbolt. Indra in the Hindu pantheon has a thunderbolt. Um, Thor from Germanic mythology, he does not have a thunderbolt, but his hammer, Mjolnir, the word Mjolnir comes from an old Indo-European word that means lightning. And likewise, his name, Thor or Thor, as the Icelandic people would tell you, they'd say, hey, you're pronouncing it wrong. It's not Thor, it's Thor. They would say that that word comes from an old Indo-European word that means thunder. And this is even preserved in like, you know, the what's that Christmas carol? Um, oh, is it just Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer? What's the one where we sing about all the reindeer? Dasher, Dancer, Donner, and Blitzen. Donner and Blitzen are thunder and lightning, right? So, anyway, sorry to get all folkloric on you. The real explanation, though, is electrical discharge, and most of the time it goes from cloud to cloud or from cloud to ground because it's lightning is negatively charged. But sometimes you can have positively charged lightning that goes from the ground to the cloud. Particularly if you've seen footage of a volcanic eruption, you've probably seen lightning, perhaps in the ash cloud of the eruption, but there's no thunderstorm. Well, that's because that's positively charged and it's going from the ground to the sky. So that's an explanation of lightning. But what about some purported supernatural phenomena, right? Like ghosts. How would we explain ghosts? Well, a naturalist would explain them away, as in explain what's really going on and eliminating the ghost explanation. So if you heard, for example, eerie noises in your house and you put your sound recorders out and you heard voices, or you hook up your camera and you detect orbs, right? A skeptic would say, well, it's not a ghost. It's the fact that you live in an old house. You're seeing orbs in your camera because those are artifacts. Those are visual artifacts in the camera. You're hearing voices in the ambient noise you recorded because of pareidolia, which is a psychological phenomenon where we find a signal within the noise that isn't really there. We see patterns that aren't really there. And so there, I'm not explaining your haunted house by appealing to ghosts. I'm explaining away the ghosts. And some people accuse Dennett of explaining away consciousness in a similar sort of way. I don't think that's what Dennett meant to do. I think that he wants to actually explain it, but he gets accused of explaining it away. In other words, kind of saying there's nothing to explain because we've explained these other things. Now, how does Dennett think this all works? On his theory of multiple drafts, everything that goes on, for lack of a better term, in consciousness, all your things that you perceive, the thoughts you have, the emotions you experience, etc., are all accomplished by these various processes running in parallel with one another throughout the entire brain. All these parallel neurological processes are always interpreting sensory inputs, they're constantly updating them. It's as if we have many, many different drafts of a book constantly being revised and updated and probed by other drafts. And these drafts are the processes. And these drafts can be at different stages of editing at different times. And it's all underwritten by different areas of the brain, all working in parallel with one another. Which of the processes are conscious? That's a question that we really shouldn't be too concerned with. There's no one place in the brain where it all comes together, right? There's no self to whom this is all presented. There's no mental stage or mental screen. There are just many, many different drafts which are constantly being edited and revised all the time. We have a sense of a stream of consciousness, sure. But this occurs when one sort of stream is probed by another. And these are all, again, this is all happening simultaneously, all in concert with one another. Some of these drafts might be used when you're having a visual experience, when you're saying something, when you're initiating a movement, but they fade in and out of awareness. They fade in and out of existence. It's kind of like if you were to go to the symphony. Has anyone ever been to the symphony? Like go to see a symphony orchestra? And if you were to ask, what is the symphony? Oh, good. Well, I'll tell you what, if you haven't, you should. It's pretty cool. My partner used to work for the Ottawa Symphony Orchestra, so I used to get to see a couple of shows every once in a while. It's kind of cool to see a symphony orchestra do their thing. But if you were to say, like, what is the piece of music? Is it what's written down? No, it's what's being played by all of the instruments in concert with one another. And all of the players are not only reading their sheet music, but they're also looking at the conductor and listening to what everyone else is playing and kind of making sure that it all seems like one coherent piece of music, even though it's dozens of instruments playing dozens of different things at different times. Consciousness is like that for Dennett. So the symphony is not the thing you hear, it's not what's written on the page. It's all of the musicians working in concert with the conductor to produce this piece of music over time, literally in concert with one another. And that's how I think of Dennett's multiple drafts theory. So Michael says, to explain parallel or multiple processing, I prefer the model of multiple windows in a web browser on a single monitor. 10 windows open, possibly updating in the background, but only one has your focus attention. Yeah, that's another way to think of it. If you're the kind of person that has lots of tabs open at any one time, right, you can't see what's on every tab at every time. But every tab, like Michael says, might be updating and continuing to represent something. And you can click on it for a second and then click on something else. And only one thing is going to be in that attentional spotlight at a time. So yeah, I think that's another way you can think of it. Another example, imagine that you see a bird flying past your window, and you say, okay, I consciously had that experience. I consciously perceived the bird. Now that is really a result of probing your stream of drafts at one of many, many, many different possible points. So there is no actual experience, being played on some kind of mental screen of seeing this bird flying past your window, right? Instead, what Dennett is saying is that the contents of consciousness arise, uh, get revised, they can affect behavior and leave traces on our memory in other streams, and they can affect how other streams get revised as well. And so, in this way, it comes to seem like there's a mental screen or a mental theater. But this is just a seeming. It's not the way it actually is. Then it even says, we must not make the mistake of supposing that there are facts, unrecoverable but actual facts, about which contents were conscious and which were not at the time. So the answer to the question, what did you experience when the bird flew past the window, doesn't have a right answer because there's no show and no mental theater. It's all just multiple drafts being constantly updated, revised, probing one another, etc. There seems to be a self, but again, this is just a seeming, just an illusion for Dennett. So, in his own words, when a portion of the world comes to compose a skein of narratives, that portion of the world is the observer, a sort of center of narrative gravity. There is a self for Dennett, but the way the self seems is not the way the self really is. The self is this skein of narratives or this center of narrative gravity. Previous to this class, I taught personal identity and the self. And when we covered some of Dennett's theories of the self, we had occasion to talk about his whole call me Gilbert thought experiment, where we have a novel writing machine. And this novel writing machine has to write a novel. Yeah, Jack. Yeah, I like that one too, Jack. And the novel writing machine says, "Call me Gilbert." Now, Gilbert is a character in the narrative that the machine is writing, not the machine. You are a character in the narrative that your brain is weaving. Yourself is that character. Your brain is the novel writing machine. So when the novel writing machine says, "Call me Gilbert," Gilbert is a fiction. But there is a novel writing machine generating a narrative. In the same way, the I that I think I am, is a fiction spun by my brain. So fun to think about, but also kind of disturbing if you're really attached to, what we could think of as ego theories of the self, belief that the self is a unified, um, independently existing thing that persists over time, like Descartes believed. So, oh, Michael says, if the bird flying by the window was a large hawk and my small dog was out in the yard, I would react differently than it was a sparrow. How would Dennett deal with the difference? Well, he would just say that, well, I mean, I don't think there really is anything to deal with. Your narratives, your drafts are going to represent the hawk as larger and possibly a danger to your pet. But it's not like it's on some kind of mental film that you can go back and review later. That's more of Dennett's point, right? The point is that your conscious experience of the hawk is not something presented to you like a movie or a play. It's something that seems that way, but really arises out of these multiple drafts that are always kind of updating themselves in light of new information. And this is the way that neuroscientists think the brain works, right? I mean, the brain is basically like a naturally evolved hypothesis generating machine where it's always trying to, for lack of a better term, guess how the world is and represent it that way. And then it constantly updates that representation based on new information. So it's always making predictions and testing those predictions against new information. So that is how the brain works. And that is very much in line with what Dennett is saying about the mind here, right? So now, if Dennett is right, then there's no worries about Cartesian materialism. But how does he deal with subjectivity? Well, this is what this is why he gets accused of explaining things away. He says, "What about the actual phenomenology? There is no such thing." You know, that's why people say he hasn't really explained consciousness. What he's done is he's explained it away, but he hasn't explained it. He's dispensed with it, like a skeptic would dispense with ghosts as an explanation for the strange noises you hear in your house at night, right? Now, he's not denying that subjective experiences happen, but he thinks we're mistaken about the nature of those experiences. And Blackmore says, if you find this difficult, you're probably beginning to understand it, which I really like. I'm going to head upstairs because my computer is dying. And I don't want to drop out in the middle of a lecture. So, okay. I feel like I'm on Cribs. Welcome my crib. That's my window. This is over there. Got a balcony out there. What up? There's some art. Where's some art? Our friend Brittany painted that. She's kind of a hippie with wanderlust who travels the world. Got some plants here. Can't see very well because it's too bright, but okay, now we're upstairs. All right, now we can plug the computer in and not lose battery power. There we go. I really like my computer, but it's a gaming laptop, so it's kind of a battery hog, even when I have it on like power saving mode. It doesn't save too much power. Yeah, it's like I mean, this is a pretty small place, but it's got a lot of character. My old apartment was larger and it had this really sick mural on the wall by a guy named Blaine Fontana, he's some kind of artist out in Portland now, but he was friends with some of the previous tenants and he drew this weird mural um on the wall. And when we moved in, we thought, well, we have to keep that, obviously. See if I can find some of his artwork. I don't know how to spell Blaine. Yeah, so sometimes see if I can find what some similar thing. None of our murals were as cool as these, but it was just a quick little one. But it had like a weird little guy and a mustache dude and a weird dude with glasses. But this is the kind of stuff. Oh, look, he's looks like he's painted Carl Sagan there in that picture. That's pretty cool. But this is what he's up to now. But it was just kind of cool to have like some of this guy's work in our apartment. And then unfortunately, the building was sold and we were renovicted, and that mural no longer exists, which is a real tragedy, I think. Um, yeah, fantastic artist. I mean, I never met the guy. He was long gone by the time my partner and I moved in there, but we were there for a while. Rent was cheap. Landlord was terrible. But then he sold the building and we had to go. And this place is smaller, but the landlords are nice. They actually fix problems instead of leaving them forever, which is nice. I like that. I like when landlords do that. So So Dennett says there's no actual phenomenology. There's just the way it seems to us. There are no facts about our phenomenology. I mean, think of the dress, right? When we talked about the dress. Now, some of you saw the dress as what did I see it as white and gold, and what's black and blue is the other one that people tend to see it as. And you want to know what color is the dress? There's no fact of the matter for Dennett. There are facts of the matter about what wavelengths of light are being reflected off the dress, but there's no fact that says it's blue and black or that it's white and gold. That's what Dennett means here. So now we're getting to the end. We're going to swing around to the hard problem of consciousness, which was articulated by David Chalmers. He makes this distinction between the easy problems and the hard problems. The easy problems are, as we saw last time, the questions that we can answer about the bat's physiology. In this context, it's neurophysiology. You know, how the different parts of its brain work and how its sensory systems work. How it locates prey using clicks and what brain regions are recruited when a bat does that, right? The hard problem is explaining subjectivity. What is it like to be a bat would be a hard problem. Explaining why there are qualia and why they are the way they are is related to the hard problem, right? When it comes to people, right? Like there are lots of easy problems that we can solve with the tools of the cognitive sciences. Like, let's say you want to know, well, what is the relationship between perceived color and the wavelength of light? You can easily do an experiment. Light of this wavelength, people, majority of people with normal color vision say that this is red, this is blue, this is green, right? And we all agree about that. And barring any weird inverted spectrum cases or cases of color blindness or anything like that, we can determine like, okay, so light with a wavelength of 700 or so nanometers looks kind of red, right? That's an easy problem. We can do this with sound, right? What does the fifth A on the piano keyboard that vibrates at 440 cycles per second? So that's an A. What does an A sound like? Well, we can find some people with absolute pitch, and they can identify, oh, that's A, right? And it's always going to be 440 hertz. That A5, the fifth A on the keyboard of a piano. But why does an A sound like an A and not a C sharp? Why does red look red and not some other color? Why are there even qualia at all? Those are the hard problems. So some people think that we can eventually get a handle on the hard problem, and some people think it's going to remain a mystery. Here are 4 answers to the hard problem. And you can see, what I really want to emphasize here as well, actually, before we look at these, is just how closely connected the hard problem is with the mind-body problem. And in addition, the problem of mental causation, right? The hard problem is, how do we explain subjective consciousness? How do we explain qualia? That's very related to the mind-body problem, because the mind-body problem, when we look at that, we run into issues like, how is it that brain activity gives rise to a subjective conscious experience? Descartes thought that it was a matter of the soul. But as we saw very early on, Princess Elizabeth was right to point out that it's kind of absurd to say that a physical and non-physical substance can even interact with one another, right? Princess Elizabeth would sooner be a materialist than accept mind-body dualism. And of course, what I'm also describing here is pretty much also just the problem of mental causation, right? Like, how can physical events cause mental events? Can mental events cause physical events? These are also very closely related to the hard problem. It's the same general set of problems that really we've been talking about since Descartes. which is one of the reasons why Descartes is considered the father of modern philosophy. Is the materialist, physicalist, and naturalist the same thing? That's a good question, Jacob. So, a materialist is someone who believes that everything is just matter in motion. And materialism was big in Descartes' day, right? Like Galileo, Kepler, well, probably not Kepler because he was quite a religious man, but at least when it came to his science, he was a materialist. Isaac Newton, right? These are all materialist, mechanistic outlooks on the universe because they say that the only thing that exists in nature is matter in motion. The motion of the matter is governed by natural laws, regularities in nature. Physicalism includes things that are not material but are still just subject to the laws of nature. So, um, if you're a materialist, how are you going to explain like electromagnetic fields or subatomic particles, or like how can light be a wave and a particle? You need to be a physicalist, to talk about those non-material things that are still physical. So physicalism is like materialism updated. Naturalism, most naturalists are physicalists, and naturalism just says that whatever exists is natural, physical stuff. In fact, our word for physics comes from the ancient Greek word for nature, physis. So yeah, they are kind of the same thing. Well, Taylor, back in the day, like not all of these thinkers were like ardent materialists. There were maybe a few. Um, Thomas Hobbes strikes me as one, where Thomas Hobbes, he talks a lot about God, but you get the impression when you're reading him that he was probably an atheist. And I have some old political science professors that would back me up on that. But Descartes was a materialist for everything except for the soul, right? The body was a machine. Animal bodies were machines. Bodies in nature, nature itself was a machine. It's an idea that's come to be known as the clockwork universe, where everything in nature is mechanical and is kind of governed by these natural laws, as if God was a watchmaker and the universe was the watch. So God makes the universe, he gets all the material there, he sets the rules for its operation, he winds it up and lets it go, and then he doesn't interfere. And so most of those materialist thinkers, like Descartes, like Galileo, like Newton, were materialists when it came to the natural world, but not when it came to the human being. Although arguably Hobbes was, and I think arguably Lemaitre was, and Huxley as well. But of course, Huxley comes at a time when we're getting much closer to modernity than Descartes was. Now, and this is kind of why the hard problem is so hard, right? Because scientists nowadays take a naturalist, physicalist sort of outlook. So they have the challenge of explaining subjective experience using objective third person means and tools, and that's hard to do. I'm not going to say it's not a problem, but the alternative is dualism, some kind of dualism. Most philosophers who are dualists are property dualists, but if you talk to somebody who subscribes to one of the Abrahamic religions, they're going to be what we would call in philosophy a substance dualist, right? Like if you're Jewish or you're Christian or you're a Muslim and you believe in a soul, like you're a dualist and that soul is immaterial. You're pretty much on the same page as Descartes, right? So that's one alternative. You can opt for property dualism, or you can be some kind of physicalist and try to explain the mind-body problem. Either way you go, there are questions that don't have answers. It's just that most people are not dualists nowadays because those questions, like mind-body interaction between uh, physical substance and mental substance, has gone unexplained for years, for centuries. So that's why we've abandoned dualism in philosophy and in science. Substance dualism, I should say. I've got to say, like, I'm a physicalist, but I certainly think that I'm also conscious and that there's something that needs explaining there. And I think, well, I gotta. It's like Carl Sagan right here, right? If you've read this, or if you've seen the show Cosmos, which you should. Neil deGrasse Tyson's done the sequel series, which are good, but Sagan's is like the original. And one of the things he says is that we are a way for the universe to know itself. We are made. The materials that make our bodies up were created in the cores of dying stars billions of years ago. And we tend to this goes all the way back to the ancient Greeks, who thought that they could use reason to stand apart from cosmos, from the ordered whole of existence, and understand it. But really, we're still a part of the universe, and as a part of the universe that thinks, we're a way for the universe to know itself, to understand itself. And I think that is really cool. I don't need there to be ghosts or gods or souls to have a meaningful experience as a human being, right? And I do think that one day we will work out the mysteries of consciousness. But these folks, for option number one, these are the folks that think that we won't figure it out. The hard problem is insoluble, they say. William James was one of these. He thought that we could never figure out subjective consciousness, as do the new Mysterians. Colin McGinn, for example, says that our brains are not sophisticated enough to understand consciousness. Like, where's my dog? She's over, I don't know where she is, but if I give let's say I get my dog Tula to read Nietzsche, um, she doesn't have the brain for that. It's not gonna happen. Similarly, humans don't have the brains to understand how consciousness works. Maybe some other life forms do. Maybe there are super intelligent aliens somewhere who are cognitively sophisticated enough to solve the mysteries of consciousness, but not us. That's what McGinn would say. Steven Pinker says something similar. He says that we can understand how minds work. I think Chalmers would say, we can understand the easy problems, but understanding phenomenal consciousness will be forever beyond our conceptual grasp. I don't agree with with this camp, but it is possible that they're right. I have to admit, it could be the case. Tula, come here. It could be the case that maybe our brains are not sophisticated enough to figure it out. Hi, Toots. You want to read some Nietzsche? Gay science? What do you think? Okay. Truthfulness. I favor any skepsis to which I may reply. Let us try it. But I no longer wish to hear anything of those things and questions that do not permit any experiment. This is the limit of my truthfulness, for there courage has lost its right. What do you think? Oh, yeah. See? What if we're like that when it comes to consciousness? Maybe. Jacob says, I disagree with that, especially like in Einstein and his advancement in physics, with his theory still being proven right. Yeah, I see what you mean. I would counter, I would say, like, if I put my new Mysterian hat on, I would say maybe consciousness is even more complicated than that. But I do agree with the general thrust of that comment, right? That I mean, if somebody could figure that out, then someone's got to be able to figure consciousness out. Right. So yeah, I would say I agree. But I think a new Mysterian would just say, well, consciousness is way more complicated than general and special relativity. Well, I appreciate your vote of confidence. I doubt it will be me. Um, I think this is something that is going to take many, many more years. But I'm going to tell you what Professor Andrew Brooke told all of us when I was in grad school. It might be one of you if you stick with this. I don't think it's a problem that, I don't know if it's a problem that my generation will solve. One of you might. David Chalmers says that maybe information has two basic aspects. And so he thinks we should try and solve the hard problem. One of the ways that we can do that is by saying there are physical aspects to information and experiential aspects. So this is almost like a sort of property dualism, right? So we should try to hard the solve problem. No, we should try and solve the hard problem. And one solution is dual aspect theory or property dualism. Chris Clark, a mathematician, says that mind is an aspect of the universe. Mind emerges prior to space and time, and this is an idea called panpsychism. Nowadays, we have, I believe, Philip Goff is a panpsychist as well. If you're interested in philosopher, neuroscience, people who advocate for panpsychism, but basically, panpsychism says that mind, like things such as space and time, is a fundamental aspect of the universe. So everything is a little bit conscious, and very sophisticated systems like human brains are really conscious. So that's panpsychism. Maybe we can solve the hard problem that way. Or we could solve it as Roger Penrose does. He writes in his book, The Emperor's New Mind, that consciousness and indeed human cognition don't depend on algorithmic processes. So Putnam, who said that the mind is like a Turing machine, well, Roger Penrose disagrees with that. He doesn't think that the mind is a computer. The mind is not a Turing machine. It depends on non-algorithmic processes. And he and this guy named Stuart Hameroff, who's an anesthesiologist, they have developed a theory where experience is like a quality of space-time that boils down to what happens at the quantum level in nerve cells. It kind of, for me, I mean, this is my personal opinion, but it kind of at times starts to look a little bit like quantum mysticism. But who knows? This is something that we can actually check, like experimentally, whether there are, quantum phenomena that underwrite aspects of our consciousness. One day we will actually be able to experiment and figure that out. So at least it's something that's in principle testable, right? So on each of these views, we could solve the hard problem, but we'll have to rethink what we know about the universe. We might have to rethink the nature of information, as Chalmers does. We might have to rethink the nature of mind as a fundamental part of reality, or we might have to rethink about how brains and quantum processes are related to one another. Approach number 3 says, let's tackle the easy problems. Why? Well, the hard problem, maybe we can solve it, maybe we can't. Either way, we're not going to solve it right now. So let's just focus on the easy problems. And the easy problems are the ones we can tackle with the tools that we already have. Psychology, cognitive science, AI, right? And if we take option number 3, one of the things that we want to try and do is identify the neural correlates of consciousness. What is going on in the brain at the same time as certain conscious experiences? Maybe we can kind of make some traction towards solving the hard problem, make some progress, I should say, by answering the easy problems. And one easy problem is what's going on in the brain at the objective level of description when I'm having this subjective experience versus that subjective experience. Like, what's going on in the brain of someone who sees the dress as white and gold versus what's going on in the brain of someone who sees it as black and blue, right? That's looking for this kind of thing. The psychophysics stuff I mentioned earlier, like understanding the relationship between sensory stimuli and subjective experience, wavelengths of light resulting in different experiences of color, different frequencies of sound resulting in um, different perceived tones. Pitch, that's what pitch is. Pitch is subjective. Um, these are easy problems. And if we look at them at the level of the brain, then what we're doing is trying to identify the neural correlates of consciousness. And finally, number 4, there is no hard problem. This is what O'Hara and Scott say. They claim there is no hard problem. Chalmers is overblowing this. They say that we should start with the easy problems. And once we start to solve the easy problems, that will change our understanding of the hard problem. We shouldn't try and solve the hard problem now, but we'll start with the easy problems. And moreover, if there is a solution to the hard problem, it'll only be useful to us if we can recognize it as a solution. And right now, we wouldn't be able to recognize that solution because we don't understand the hard problem well enough. So those are the 3 options. We can't solve it. We should try and solve it. We should try the easy problems, or we should solve the easy problems, and then we'll either find a solution or we'll find that there was no hard problem. Dennett takes a similar view to Scott and O'Hara. He says, Chalmers' view of the hard problem is kind of reminiscent of how a vitalist looked at the hard problem of life, right? If you were to claim that there's a hard problem of life, how do we explain life? What would you say? Would you say something like, even after we explain reproduction, metabolism, and growth, the easy problems, the hard problem of life would remain? Well, no. And we've explained away concepts like élan vital, the vital principle. We don't need to explain élan vital because we've explained reproduction, metabolism, and growth. We don't need élan vital to explain life. We've answered the easy problems, and we see that there actually is no hard problem of life. Dennett says that Chalmers' hard problem is a theorist's illusion, something inviting therapy, not a real problem to be solved with revolutionary new science. Ooh, bodied. I mean, I like Chalmers. I like Dennett. But I think I agree with Dennett. It could turn out that when we solve the easy problems, there is no hard problem. Yeah, I mean, I like Chalmers. I think he's a character. But Dennett just explains things in a way that makes so much more sense to me. I don't understand Chalmers's draw, like the appeal of dualism to Chalmers, but I don't know. As we've seen, Dennett thinks that when we think there is a hard problem, it's because we have this misconstrual of what consciousness is. It seems as though there is actual phenomenology when really what phenomenology amounts to are these sort of multiple drafts. And to explain consciousness, we have to explain how it comes to seem as if there are facts of the matter about phenomenology. We have to explain the illusion. And that is the task that you have before you if you decide to stick with philosophy or cognitive science and try and explore the mysteries of consciousness. It's one of my favorite topics, and I'm sure I'll continue talking about it for many more years. But that is all I have. And I wanted to say, I'm sure we have some time left for questions, but I just wanted to say before I forget that you guys have made this very enjoyable to teach, and you've all done very well. it's never easy to get conversation going in an online class, yet I think the conversation has been quite lively this term. I've been very impressed with how everyone's done on their quizzes, and at least when it comes to the essay proposals that I was responsible for evaluating, I'm really impressed with the range of topics that you're all interested in writing in. And I know that our textbook was very bland and dry and technical, but even so, I think a lot of you did a very good job of engaging with the material. So you guys should, I know, it's not over. The final quiz is due tomorrow at midnight, so you still have to write that if you haven't already. And of course, you still have to write your final essay. But you should really give yourselves a hand for the job you've done so far. You really made this a fun one for me to teach. And I had a great time. I had a great time teaching this course. So thanks everybody for that. Now, do any of you have any questions about either what we've talked about today or about the final assignment that I can answer before we end our final lecture? Yes, Taylor, I believe yours was emailed to me. So I am going to have those finished later today, and then everything will be emailed back to you. So you'll have yours by this evening. I just wanted to get to the stuff that was submitted on Bright, like by the deadline first. But I'm really close to being done everything else. You'll have it later tonight. Um, oh, thanks, Michael. Yeah, I try, because teaching online is hard, but I've done quite a lot of teaching online because when I really went full tilt at teaching, it was the height of the pandemic and everybody was stuck at home. And I guess everybody was bored and they wanted to take philosophy classes because they had me teaching all kinds of classes. And some people hate teaching online. I know Professor Matheson really hates teaching online. Dave Matheson, he doesn't like it. I don't blame him. Um, but my experience, I guess, has been a little different, and I'm used to it, and I don't mind. I like delivering it online. Jacob says, had fun. Thank you. Thank you. Different side to philosophy. Yeah, I'm really a mind person. I like the mind. I like consciousness. I like all this stuff. I mean, I wrote my master's thesis about robots and stuff. I wrote the PhD all about the Turing test. Yeah. Oh, thanks, Taylor. Well, you did really good. You did really good for somebody who's not a philosopher, someone who's coming from that history background. You did a really good job, especially in terms of well, everything. I mean, yeah, all of you did really great. Yeah, okay, yeah. Thomas, yeah, that's going to be fun. I think you're going to enjoy it. I've had a few, yeah, like Taylor and Jack were in, or one of the Jacks was in paranormal, I think. Oh, is this your last one? Yeah, Jack Reagan was in that one, right? Well, philosophy of the paranormal is going to be fun, but what I will say is if you go in thinking that I'm going to explain how ghosts exist and how uh astrology works, you will be disappointed because I tell you how ghosts don't exist and how astrology doesn't work. But basically, it's like a class where we can learn about naturalism, we can learn about philosophy of science, we can learn about skepticism and science literacy, um, and we can have a lot of fun while we do it. So that's why that's a fun course. Ah, thanks, Elizabeth. That's my job. So that means I've done my job. So you know what? But enough, guys. Don't you don't have to. Save it for the course reviews or whatever, right? Um, but you guys all did great. Now it was such a great bunch of students, and I always have a thing. I always have a fun time. I'm really lucky, prof, because I always get interested students. The ones who aren't interested, they just end up not showing up. So I'm always left with the interested people, and we all have a great time learning together, right? So thank you all so much for that. Well, I guess that's it. So thanks everyone, and remember, there is an open door policy. So if you have any questions about writing the essay, please do get in touch. If not, I want to wish you all the best for your future, whether you're continuing your studies or graduating. Thank you so much for making this fun. It was a pleasure to teach you all a little bit about the mind. And for those of you who will be joining me in another class, I'll see you next time. All right, that's it. Bye for now, everyone.